The air in the abandoned warehouse tasted of rust and finality. It was a cold, metallic tang that coated the back of Julian's throat, a flavor he associated with surgical steel and the slow, inevitable cooling of flesh. Rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof, each drop a percussive beat in a symphony of decay. Inside, the only light came from a single bare bulb dangling from a frayed wire, its jaundiced glow casting long, dancing shadows that clung to the corners like frightened things. It illuminated a tableau of controlled chaos, men in dark suits, their faces grim and unreadable, their stillness a coiled threat. And at the center of it all, on a makeshift table, draped with a stained canvas tarp, a man was dying. Julian's hands, scrubbed raw with antiseptic from a bottle someone had shoved at him, felt preternaturally steady. They always were. In the operating theater, under the sterile blaze of surgical lamps, his hands were instruments of divine precision. Here, in this cathedral of rot and fear, they were the only part of him that wasn't trembling. He was not a surgeon anymore, not since the inquiry, the whispers, the quiet, ruinous dismissal. Now he was just a man with a specific, dangerous skill set, dragged from his threadbare apartment into the city's bleeding underbelly. The man on the table was a canvas of ruin. His bespoke suit, a thing of impossible expense, was shredded and soaked in a slick, dark crimson that steamed faintly in the damp air. A bullet wound, high on the chest. A sucking wound. Julian could hear it, a wet, desperate whistle with every ragged breath. He pressed his ear to the man's chest, ignoring the sticky warmth, and heard the muffled, frantic beat of a heart drowning in its own vessel. "He needs a chest tube," Julian said, his voice a low, clinical thing, stripped of all emotion. It was a statement of fact, not a request. And a hospital. Now. A man with a face like a weathered stone stepped forward. "There is no hospital." His voice was gravel. "There is only you." The finality in his tone was absolute. Julian looked from the stone-faced man to the dying one. The man on the table's eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a winter sky, a pale, piercing gray that held a universe of cold authority, even as life was guttering out. They fixed on Julian, not with pleading, but with a silent, chilling command. Fix this. Julian's mind, a place of order and procedure, began to click into place, overriding the fear. He was a machine built for this. "I need a knife, a clean one, and a tube, any kind of plastic tube, and fire." The men moved with unnerving efficiency. A gleaming switchblade appeared in a gloved hand. Another man produced a length of clear plastic tubing from a medical kit that looked as brutally utilitarian as everything else in the room. A third flicked open a silver lighter, the flame a tiny, defiant star in the gloom. This was butchery. It was a violation of every oath had ever taken. But the alternative was watching a man die, and that was a violation of his very nature. He sterilized the blade in the flame, the metal hissing. He felt the grey eyes on him, an anchor in the swirling panic. He found the space between the ribs with the practiced touch of a master craftsman. He made the incision. There was a sickening release of pressure, a gush of dark fluid and trapped air. The ragged whistle of the man's breathing eased, replaced by a deeper, more even cadence. It was not a solution. It was a pause button, a stay of execution. He threaded the tube, a crude, improvised device, into the pleural cavity. "This won't hold," he stated, his gaze meeting the stone-faced man's. "He has minutes, an hour at most." The grey-eyed man on the table spoke, his voice a strained, raw whisper, but a whisper that carried the weight of iron. "It will be enough." Then his eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness, his life now tethered to the world by a plastic tube and a disgraced surgeon's desperate gamble. Julian worked, his movements fluid and economical, a ballet of damage control. He packed the wound, used strips of a torn shirt to tape the tube in place. His mind was a silent hum of anatomical charts and surgical protocols, a sanctuary of logic against the encroaching madness. He was not saving a man. He was stabilizing a complex biological system. He was not an accomplice. He was a technician. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a ghost, a pair of hands, and when this was over, he would disappear back into the shadows from which he had been plucked. He had to believe that. The belief was as vital as the next breath. The rain on the roof slowed to a murmur, the world outside holding its breath. In the sudden quiet, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic drip of blood onto the concrete floor. A life held in abeyance, a debt being incurred. Months passed. The rain-slicked memory of that night faded, blurring at the edges like a watercolor left in a storm. Julian had pushed it down, buried it under the crushing weight of his new, diminished reality. He worked nights at a 24-hour clinic in a part of the city the maps preferred to forget, stitching up drunks and patching up the casualties of petty desperation. The ghost of his former life haunted him in the fluorescent hum of the clinic, in the phantom sensation of a perfectly balanced scalpel in his hand. He had been a prodigy, a rising star in the surgical firmament. Now he was a man who smelled of antiseptic and cheap coffee, his brilliance relegated to setting broken fingers and prescribing antibiotics. He had convinced himself he was safe in his anonymity. He had convinced himself it was over. He was wrong. The car that pulled up beside him as he walked home one pre-dawn morning was a slash of obsidian against the grey cityscape. It was silent, electric, and utterly out of place. The window, a sheet of tinted black, slid down with a faint whir. Inside, the man with the face of weathered stone regarded him with the same flat, emotionless expression. "Mr. Volkov requires your presence." It was not a request. Julian's blood went cold. Volkov. The name was a whisper in the city's dark corners, a myth of power and violence. The man from the warehouse. The man with the winter sky eyes. "I don't know any Mr. Volkov," Julian lied, his voice thinner than he wanted. The man's lips twitched, a barely perceptible motion that was not a smile. "He knows you." The drive was silent, a journey through the city's arteries into its heart of wealth and power. They left the grit and decay behind, ascending into a world of clean lines, polished chrome, and sweeping glass. The building they entered was less an apartment and more a fortress in the sky, a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds. The air inside was cool and still, scented with something subtle and expensive, like sandalwood and ozone. It was a world of monastic luxury, all polished concrete, dark wood, and vast windows that displayed the sprawling city below like a conquered territory. And there, standing before one of those windows, silhouetted against the nascent dawn, was Alexei Volkov. He was no longer a broken thing on a dirty tarp. He was whole, immaculate, in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin. He turned, and the pale grey eyes, now clear and sharp, found Julian across the expanse of the room. The scar on his chest would be hidden beneath the fine fabric, a secret testament to the night that bound them. Dr. Thorne, Alexi's voice was smooth, a low baritone that held the same intrinsic authority it had when it was a ragged whisper. A pleasure to see you in better circumstances. Julian's hands clenched into fists in his pockets. What do you want? Alexei moved towards him, his steps measured and silent on the dark wood floor. He stopped a few feet away, his presence a palpable force field of power and control. That night, he began, his gaze unwavering. You saved a life. My life. Julian said nothing. The air crackled with unspoken tension. In my world, Alexei continued, his tone conversational, yet laced with steel. Debts are a form of currency, the most sacred form. A life for a life. It is the oldest rule. A cold dread, sharp and precise, lanced through Julian. I don't want your money. I am not offering money. Alexei's eyes swept over him, a clinical, possessive assessment. It was the look of a connoisseur examining a piece of art, a collector appraising a rare acquisition. You saved my life, Doctor. Therefore, you owe me a life. Julian stared, uncomprehending. That makes no sense. It makes perfect sense, Alexei corrected gently. I am alive because of you. My life continues. The life that is owed in return is yours. He paused, letting the words hang in the sterile air, letting their monstrous weight settle. From this moment, your life belongs to me. The declaration was so absurd, so fundamentally insane, that for a moment Julian could only stare. Laughter, sharp and hysterical, threatened to bubble up from his chest. He choked it down. The look in Alexei Volkov's eyes was not one of madness. It was the calm, rational gaze of a man stating an irrefutable fact, a law of his own private universe. You can't be serious, Julian breathed, the words barely audible. I am always serious. Alexei's gaze was unflinching, a physical weight pressing down on him. You will live here. You will be provided with anything you require. Your material needs will be met beyond your imagining. In return, you will be at my disposal. You will be my physician. You will be mine. The last word was spoken softly, almost a whisper, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Mine. A brand. A sentence. Julian thought of his small, shabby apartment, his thankless job, the ghost of a life he once had. It was a miserable existence, but it was his. The freedom to be miserable was still freedom. No, he said, the word tasting of defiance and terror. I have a life. It's not much, but it's mine to live. Alexei's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something cold and ancient moved in the depths of his grey eyes. You misunderstand, he said, his voice dropping, becoming even quieter, more dangerous. This is not a negotiation. You are a man of logic, Doctor. Consider the variables. You are here. My associate, Kirill. He gestured almost imperceptibly towards the stone-faced man who stood like a statue by the door. Is there? The city below is vast and indifferent. Where precisely did you imagine you could go? The question was a cage, its bars forged from impeccable, brutal logic. Julian's mind raced, searching for an exit, a loophole, an argument that could penetrate this wall of absolute certainty. He found nothing. He was a surgeon, a man who dealt in the tangible realities of bone and blood and tissue. He had no weapons against this kind of abstract, philosophical tyranny. He was outmaneuvered, outclassed, trapped not by walls, but by a single, unshakable will. This is kidnapping, he managed, his voice hollow. This is a transaction, Alexei corrected smoothly. the terms of which were set the moment you chose to place your hands on me. You made a choice, Dr. Thorne. You interfered. Now you will live with the consequences." He turned away, a gesture of dismissal, and walked back towards the window, his posture radiating an unnerving finality. "Kirill will show you to your quarters. Settle in. Your new life begins now." Julian stood frozen, the city lights twinkling mockingly behind Alexei's silhouette. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a possession. The distinction was academic. The reality was a gilded cage, descending. The scent of sandalwood and ozone was the scent of his prison. He looked at his hands, the hands that had saved this man. They felt alien, the instruments of his own damnation. He had traded one man's life for his own. And in the cruel calculus of Alexei Volkov's world, it was a perfectly balanced equation. The rooms assigned to him were a study in luxurious confinement. They were spacious, impeccably furnished, with a wall of glass that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city. It was a view from a cage, a constant reminder of the world he could see but no longer touch. The fabrics were soft, the technology was seamless, the silence was absolute. It was a tomb upholstered in silk. In the first few days, Julian tested the boundaries with a kind of frantic scientific curiosity. The main door to his suite was locked, but not in a way he could see. There was no keyhole, no bolt. It simply wouldn't open. It responded to Kirill's presence, or Alexei's, with a soft electronic chime. The windows were sealed, the glass thick and unbreakable. He was a specimen in a meticulously crafted terrarium. His old life was erased with chilling efficiency. A single box arrived, containing a few personal effects, books, a framed photograph of his long-dead parents, his grandfather's old watch. Everything else was gone. His apartment had been emptied, his job at the clinic terminated, his digital footprint scrubbed clean. He had ceased to exist as Julian Thorne, public citizen. He was now Julian Thorne, private property. Alexei was a ghost in this new reality. He was rarely seen, his presence a subtle pressure on the atmosphere of the penthouse. Sometimes Julian would catch a glimpse of him, a dark suit disappearing through a doorway, or hear the low murmur of his voice from another room. Their interactions were brief, formal, and deeply unsettling. Alexei would summon him to his study, a room lined with ancient books and modern art, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. He would sit behind a vast, obsidian desk and watch Julian with those unnervingly calm, grey eyes. "Are your accommodations satisfactory?" he would ask, his tone that of a courteous host. "Is there anything you require?" "I require my freedom," Julian would reply, his voice tight. A flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps disappointment, would cross Alexei's face. "Freedom is a matter of perspective, Doctor. You are free from financial worry, free from the indignities of your previous employment, free from the dangers of a city that has no love for men like you. This isn't freedom. It's imprisonment." "It is order," Alexei countered, his voice smooth as polished stone. "You, a man of science and precision, should appreciate order. Your life was chaos. I have given it structure." It was a maddening, circular logic that left Julian feeling breathless and impotent. He was a man used to solving problems, to diagnosing and treating. But how do you treat a pathology of the soul? How do you excise a belief system? Alexei was not a man to be reasoned with. He was a system to be endured. His role as physician was, for now, a fiction. He was given a state-of-the-art medical suite, a room gleaming with technology that made his old hospital look like a relic. It was filled with diagnostic tools, surgical equipment, and a vast pharmacopoeia. It was a temple to medicine, and he was its captive priest. But there were no patients. The men who moved silently through the penthouse were specters of perfect health. The only wounds he was asked to treat were Alexei's. They were minor, almost trivial. A cut on his hand from a broken glass, which Julian stitched with microscopic precision, his touch clinical and cold. A headache, for which he was asked to perform a neurological assessment, his fingers probing the back of the formidable man's skull as Alexei sat perfectly still, his vulnerability a calculated performance. During these moments, the air between them was electric. The professional distance Julian tried to maintain was a flimsy shield against the sheer intimacy of the acts. To touch Alexei was to feel the coiled power beneath the skin, the steady, rhythmic beat of the heart he had saved. It was a terrifying, unwelcome connection. Alexei seemed to relish it. He would watch Julian's face, his eyes searching for a crack in the professional mask. "Your hands are remarkable," he commented once, as Julian was wrapping the dressing around his palm. "They are instruments of absolute focus, no hesitation, no wasted motion. When you work, the rest of the world ceases to exist for you. I saw it that night." Julian finished his task and pulled away, the warmth of Alexei's skin a phantom sensation on his fingertips. "They are a surgeon's hands," he said flatly. "They are an artist's hands," Alexei corrected. "And I am a collector of rare and beautiful things." The statement hung in the air, a silken threat. Julian was just another piece in the collection, a living sculpture, a priceless violin to be kept in a climate-controlled case, taken out only for the owner's pleasure. The thought was suffocating. He began to retreat inward, building walls within the walls of his suite. He read the books he had been given, losing himself in Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, finding a strange, grim comfort in their tales of Russian fatalism. He exercised, pushing his body to the point of exhaustion, trying to sweat out the poison of his confinement. He stood for hours at the window, watching the city breathe below him, tracing the paths of cars like blood cells through arteries, a God's eye view that only emphasized his own powerlessness. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a ghost haunting his own life. One evening, Kirill entered his suite without a word and placed a black suit on the bed. It was made of a fine, lightweight wool, and it was, of course, a perfect fit. "Mr. Volkov requires your presence," the stone-faced man rumbled. "There is an event." Julian looked at the suit with distaste. It was a uniform, a costume for the role Alexei had assigned him. "And if I refuse?" Kirill's expression did not change. "That is not a variable under consideration." Resignation settled over Julian like a shroud. Defiance was a pointless expenditure of energy. He dressed, the fine fabric feeling like a straitjacket against his skin. He looked at himself in the mirror. He saw a stranger, a well-dressed puppet whose strings were held by an unseen hand. Kirill led him not out of the penthouse, but up to a private helipad on the roof. The wind whipped around them, carrying the sounds of the city, distant and muted. Alexei was waiting by the helicopter, a sleek black machine that looked like a predatory insect. He too was in a dark suit, his silver-grey tie a slash of light against the charcoal fabric. He gave Julian an appraising look, a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. "Tonight, you are a doctor," Alexei said, over the rising whine of the rotors. "You will be introduced as my personal physician. You will speak only when spoken to. You will observe. Is that understood?" Julian nodded, the motion stiff. He was a prop, an accessory to power. The flight was a surreal journey across a carpet of glittering lights. They landed on the roof of another skyscraper, this one hosting a gala of some kind. The air thrummed with music and the low hum of conversation. The people were beautiful, clad in jewels and designer clothes, their laughter bright and brittle. It was a world of immense, effortless wealth, and Julian felt like an interloper, a creature from another species. Alexei moved through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a predator in his own territory. People made way for him. Smiles that were fixed and artificial became, for a moment, genuinely deferential, tinged with fear. He was gravity, bending the room around him. Julian walked a step behind him, a silent shadow. He was introduced to a handful of people, a banking magnate with predatory eyes, a politician with a smile that didn't reach his soul, a woman dripping in diamonds whose gaze was as hard as her jewels. To all of them, he was Dr. Thorne, my physician. The title was a shield and a leash. It explained his presence while cementing his subordinate status. He felt Alexei's hand on the small of his back, a light but firm pressure that guided him, steered him, owned him. The touch was a brand, a constant reminder of his captivity. He was standing by a balcony, nursing a glass of champagne he had no intention of drinking, when a man approached them. He was younger than Alexei, with a restless energy and a smile that was all sharp edges. There was a rivalry there, an old and bitter one, that was palpable in the air between them. "Alexei," the man said, his voice slick, "I didn't expect to see you mingling with the mortals." "Dmitri," Alexei replied, his voice devoid of warmth. "Some of us have business to conduct. Others are merely decorative." Dmitri's eyes slid to Julian, a flicker of dismissive curiosity in their depths. "And who is this, your new pet?" The insult was casual, designed to provoke. Julian felt a surge of hot anger, but Alexei's hand on his back tightened, a silent command to stay still. "This is Dr. Thorne," Alexei said, his voice dangerously soft. "He is a man of considerable talent. You would do well to remember that." Dmitri's smile widened. "A doctor? How practical. Does he make house calls?" He looked Julian up and down, his gaze lingering in a way that was deliberately insulting. "You must be very skilled to have earned the attention of the great Alexei Volkov." Before Julian could react, Alexei stepped slightly in front of him, a subtle but unmistakable act of shielding. "My affairs, Dmitri, are not your concern," he said, the temperature in his voice dropping several degrees. "I would suggest you find your amusement elsewhere, before it is found for you." The threat was veiled, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Dmitri's smile faltered. He held Alexei's gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills before giving a slight, mocking bow. "As you wish," he said, and melted back into the crowd. The encounter left Julian shaken. He had been defended, shielded, not as a person, he told himself, but as a possession. One does not allow others to scratch one's priceless art. Yet the feeling lingered. The protective shift in Alexei's posture, the ice in his voice. It was the first time he had seen the mask of calm control slip, even for a second. It was replaced by something far more primal, possessive, territorial. Later, on the silent flight back to the penthouse, Alexei said nothing about the encounter. He simply stared out at the city lights, his profile carved from shadow and granite. But as they stepped out of the helicopter onto the roof, he paused. "Dmitri is a jackal," he said, his voice low against the wind. "He preys on what he perceives as weakness. Do not speak to him. Do not look at him. If he approaches you, you come to me. Immediately." It was an order, but it felt like more. It felt like a warning, born of something other than strategic calculation. Julian simply nodded, the cool night air doing little to quell the strange, unsettling warmth that had bloomed in his chest. He was a prisoner. He was a possession. But tonight, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he had also felt like he was protected. The distinction was becoming dangerously blurred. Life in the gilded cage settled into a strange, hypnotic rhythm. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light against the glass walls of his suite. Julian's existence became a series of quiet, ritualistic acts, reading, exercising, staring at the city below. The sharp edges of his initial terror and rage had been worn smooth by routine, leaving behind a dull, persistent ache of loss. He was a man in stasis, a life held in an indefinite pause. His interactions with Alexei evolved, becoming a complex and unnerving dance of proximity and distance. The summons to the study continued, but their purpose seemed to shift. They were less about establishing dominance and more about something else, something Julian couldn't quite name. Alexei would ask him questions, not about his needs, but about his past, about medical school, about the intricate, delicate work of microsurgery. He listened with an intensity that was both flattering and deeply unsettling, his grey eyes fixed on Julian as if trying to dissect the very workings of his mind. "Describe it," Alexei said one afternoon, swirling amber liquid in a heavy crystal glass. "The moment you open a human chest, the first sight of a living, beating heart. What does it feel like?" Julian hesitated. It was a sacred, private thing. "It's quiet," he said finally, the words coming slowly. "All the noise of the OR, the beeping machines, the voices, it all fades away. There is only the heart. It's a miracle of engineering, a perfect, self-sustaining pump. It's beautiful." He stopped, surprised at the emotion in his own voice. He hadn't spoken of it like that in years. Alexei didn't mock him. He simply nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Beauty in function," he murmured. "I understand that." In these moments, Julian would see a glimpse of the man behind the myth, a mind that appreciated complexity and order, whether in a corporate takeover, a line of poetry, or a piece of human anatomy. It was this shared appreciation for precision, for the elegant machinery of things, that formed a fragile, dangerous bridge between them. Alexei, in turn, began to reveal small, curated pieces of himself. He showed Julian his collection of antique clocks, their intricate gears and pendulums, a testament to a time when craftsmanship was paramount. He pointed out a painting on his wall, a dark, turbulent seascape by Ayvazovsky. "My grandfather loved the sea," Alexei said, his voice distant. "He said it was the only thing more powerful and less forgiving than a Russian winter." It was a sliver of personal history, offered without context, a single puzzle piece from an infinitely complex whole. The true shift came one night when Kirill appeared at his door, his stone-like face etched with a rare urgency. "He's in the gymnasium," was all he said. Julian grabbed his medical bag and followed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The gymnasium was another marvel of minimalist design, filled with sleek, black equipment. Alexei was there, shirtless, his back to the door. He was wrapping his hands, his movements tight with controlled fury. The source of his anger was evident, a series of fresh, deep bruises blooming across his ribs and a long, shallow gash along his forearm, bleeding sluggishly. Julian's clinical gaze took it all in. What happened? A disagreement, Alexei said, without turning around. His voice was tight. The other party disagreed more strongly. Julian set his bag down. "Sit," he commanded, his voice taking on the natural authority of the operating room. For a moment, he wasn't a prisoner. He was a doctor. To his surprise, Alexei obeyed, sinking onto a bench. The muscles in his back, a landscape of sculpted power, were knotted with tension. Julian approached, his fingers gently probing the bruised area. Alexei flinched, a sharp intake of breath. It was the first time Julian had ever seen an involuntary sign of pain from him. "Cracked ribs, most likely," Julian diagnosed, his touch becoming gentler. "Nothing displaced, but it will hurt to breathe for a while." He moved to the gash on Alexei's arm. "This needs cleaning and stitches." He worked in silence, his movements efficient and sure. He cleaned the wound, the antiseptic stinging. Alexei didn't move a muscle, but Julian could feel the tension radiating from him. As he prepared the suture needle, he found himself looking at the landscape of Alexei's back, at the faint, silvery lines of old scars mixed with the fresh, angry bruises. He saw the faint pucker of tissue high on his chest where his own desperate work had saved him. This body was a testament to a life of violence and control, a fortress that was, for the moment, breached. He began to stitch, the tiny needle dipping in and out of the skin, pulling the edges of the wound together. It was intimate work, far more intimate than the formal examinations in the study. Here there was no desk between them. There was only skin and blood and the shared space of injury and healing. "Why?" Julian asked, his voice low. He didn't look up from his work. "Why do you do this? You have men like Kirill. You command an army. Why are you the one coming home bruised and bleeding?" Alexei was silent for a long time, the only sound the soft pull of the thread through his skin. "A king who never bleeds is a symbol," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "A king who bleeds is a man. My men need to know I am both." He paused. "And sometimes order must be maintained with one's own hands." Julian finished the last stitch, his fingers brushing against Alexei's skin. The contact sent a jolt through him, a current of something warm and unfamiliar. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He applied a sterile dressing, his movements suddenly clumsy. "It's done," he said, his voice clipped. Alexei stood and turned to face him. The fury had drained from him, replaced by a profound weariness. His grey eyes, usually so cold and clear, were clouded. He looked at Julian, his gaze lingering on the surgeon's hands. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but coming from him, they held the weight of a confession. It was more than gratitude for a service rendered. It was an acknowledgement of something shared in the quiet intimacy of the room. Julian simply nodded, unable to speak. He felt a profound and terrifying shift in the foundation of his world. The clean lines of captor and captive, of monster and victim, were blurring. He was dressing the wounds of the man who had stolen his life, and in the act he had felt not revulsion, but a strange, unwelcome surge of empathy. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was becoming something else entirely, something more complicated, something more dangerous. And as he watched Alexei shrug on a shirt, his movements careful and pained, Julian felt a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of confinement. It was the fear of connection, the fear that the bars of his cage were beginning to feel like an embrace. The change was subtle, a shift in the climate of the penthouse. The air, once sterile and cold, now held a different kind of tension, not of threat, but of awareness. Julian felt Alexei's presence even when he was rooms away, a low hum beneath the surface of the silence. Their orbits, once separate, were now inextricably linked. Alexei began to seek him out for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. He would find Julian in the small library of his suite and simply sit, reading a different book in a comfortable chair, the two of them sharing a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a dense, unspoken dialogue. He invited Julian to join him for dinner, not as a command, but as a quiet suggestion. They would eat at the vast dining table, the city lights a glittering tapestry beyond the glass, talking of history, of art, of the cold logic of chess. Julian found himself talking more than he had in years, his own intellect, long dormant, sparking to life in response to Alexei's sharp, inquisitive mind. He was still a prisoner, a fact that sat like a cold stone in his gut, but the nature of his imprisonment was changing. The cage was becoming a world, a small, two-person universe governed by its own strange laws. He was an object of fascination, and he, in turn, was fascinated by his captor. He studied Alexei with the same intensity he would a complex medical case, noting the minute tells, the flicker of an eyelid, the tightening of a jaw that betrayed the iron control. He saw the profound loneliness in the man, a solitude so vast and deep it was part of his very architecture. Alexei Volkov was a man who commanded legions but trusted no one, a man surrounded by people but utterly alone. Except, perhaps, for Julian. The realization was a dangerous one. He was becoming Alexei's confessor, his intellectual sparring partner, the one person in his orbit who was not a subordinate or an enemy. He was a complication. The danger of this new intimacy was made brutally clear one afternoon. Julian was in the medical suite, cataloguing supplies, a mundane, grounding task, when a chime announced Alexei's arrival. But it wasn't Alexei who entered. It was Dmitri. The sight of him, here in this sanctuary, was a violation. Dmitri's smile was a predatory slash in his handsome face. He sauntered in, his expensive suit looking jarringly out of place among the sterile equipment. Two of his own men, brutish and silent, flanked the door. "Well, well," Dmitri said, his eyes roaming the room before settling on Julian. "The bird in his gilded cage. Alexei keeps you well appointed." Julian's heart pounded a frantic, panicked rhythm. He backed away, putting a stainless steel counter between them. "You're not supposed to be here." "Oh, I have an invitation," Dmitri purred, holding up a data chip. "A little business with our mutual friend, but I thought I'd come and see the prize for myself. Alexei is so protective of his things, it makes one curious." He began to walk around the room, trailing his fingers over the gleaming equipment, his touch a desecration. He picked up a scalpel, testing its weight, its edge. "These are your tools, aren't they? The famous hands of Dr. Thorne." He looked at Julian, his eyes glinting with malice. "Alexei thinks you're a masterpiece, an artist. I, on the other hand, I think you're a vulnerability, a weakness he can't afford." He took a step closer. Julian's training, his instinct for de-escalation, warred with the primal urge to run. Alexei will be here any moment. Dmitri laughed, a short, ugly sound. That's the point. I want him to find me here. I want him to see how easily his little fortress can be breached, how easily his treasures can be touched. He lunged, not with the scalpel, but with his hand, grabbing Julian's wrist. His grip was like iron. Julian flinched, a jolt of pure terror shooting through him. Dmitri's smile widened. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper. You see, not so special, just flesh and bone, easy to break. The door hissed open. Dmitri. Alexei's voice was not loud. It was a flat, dead thing, colder and more dangerous than any shout. The temperature in the room plummeted. Dmitri released Julian's wrist as if it were red hot, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his face before being replaced by his usual smirk. He turned to face Alexei, who stood in the doorway, a figure of absolute, lethal stillness. Kirill was behind him, his hand inside his jacket. Alexei, Dmitri said, his tone attempting casualness, I was just admiring your facilities and your physician. He's quite fetching up close. Alexei did not look at Dmitri. His pale grey eyes were fixed on Julian, scanning him, checking for harm. He saw the red marks forming on Julian's wrist where Dmitri had grabbed him. The air in the room seemed to solidify. When Alexei finally moved his gaze to Dmitri, his face was a mask of placid fury. The calm was more terrifying than any rage. Get out, Alexei said, the words perfectly spaced, each one a shard of ice. My business with you is concluded, permanently. If I ever see you on this floor again, Kirill will not be so restrained. Is that a threat? Dmitri sneered, trying to recover his bravado. It is a promise, Alexei said. His eyes were flat, devoid of light, like a shark's. Now you will leave, and you will not touch what is mine. Ever. Again. The possessive pronoun was a physical force, a line drawn in the sand. Mine. Dmitri, for all his bluster, was not a fool. He knew he had pushed too far. He saw the promise of annihilation in Alexei's eyes. With a curt, angry nod to his men, he turned and swept out of the room. The silence he left behind was deafening. Julian stood trembling, his wrist throbbing. He couldn't look at Alexei. He felt exposed, violated, the fragile piece of his existence shattered. Alexei crossed the room in 2 silent strides. He didn't speak. He reached out and gently took Julian's hand, turning it over to examine the red marks on his wrist. His touch was unexpectedly careful, his thumb stroking the angry skin with a tenderness that was utterly at odds with the man who had just promised murder without raising his voice. Did he hurt you? Alexei asked, his voice low and raw. Julian shook his head, unable to find his voice. His gaze was fixed on their hands, Alexei's large, powerful hand cradling his own. The contrast was stark, the killer and the healer, the hand that breaks and the hand that mends. He will not touch you again, Alexei vowed, his voice a guttural rumble. He looked up, and his eyes met Julian's. In their grey depths, Julian saw something he had never seen before. A raw, unguarded fury that was not about a breach of security or a challenged authority. It was personal. It was the rage of a man whose most prized possession had been threatened. But it was more than that. It was the protective fury of something else. Julian pulled his hand away, the contact suddenly too much, too confusing. I am not one of your paintings, Alexei, he whispered, the words ragged. I am not a clock. I am not a thing to be owned and protected. Alexei's face hardened, the mask of control snapping back into place, but his eyes still held the storm. "You are mine," he stated, the words an echo of that first day. But their meaning had changed. It was no longer just a statement of ownership. It was a declaration, a fact of his world. Whether you see that as a cage or a shield is your own perception. But the fact remains, and what is mine, I protect. He turned and left, leaving Julian alone in the gleaming, sterile room, his heart pounding a chaotic, terrified, and traitorously hopeful rhythm. The bars of the cage had just become a shield, and Julian, to his horror, was starting to feel safe behind them. The incident with Dmitri was a catalyst. The unspoken things that had been growing in the silence between them now had a name: jealousy, possessiveness, protection. The dynamic had shifted from one of simple captivity to something infinitely more complex and perilous. Alexei's control, once a blanket of oppressive calm, now had a sharp, protective edge. His presence became more constant, his gaze more watchful. The illusion of space Julian had carved for himself vanished. Alexei was always there, a silent guardian, a constant shadow. This new proximity was suffocating, and to Julian's deep shame, strangely reassuring. The fear of the outside world, embodied by Dmitri, had been made real. The penthouse, once a prison, now felt like the only safe place in the world. He was trapped in a paradox. He yearned for freedom, but he was terrified of what lay beyond the walls that Alexei's power maintained. He hated Alexei for stealing his life, but he was becoming dependent on the very strength that held him captive. His own feelings were a tangled, unreadable mess. He saw the monster in Alexei, the cold-blooded killer who moved pieces on a board of human lives. But he had also seen the man who listened to him talk about surgery with rapt attention, the man who looked at a turbulent seascape and spoke of his grandfather, the man whose hands, capable of such violence, could be so gentle. He was falling for his captor. The thought was a violation, a betrayal of the man he used to be. It was Stockholm Syndrome, he told himself, a psychological coping mechanism. It was a flaw in his own character, a weakness he despised. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a man in love with his own cage. He tried to pull away, to rebuild the walls. He became quiet, withdrawn. He declined Alexei's invitations to dinner, feigning headaches or fatigue. He immersed himself in his medical texts, seeking refuge in the cold, hard facts of science. Alexei noticed. He didn't press, didn't command. He simply watched, his grey eyes missing nothing. The space between them grew heavy with a new kind of silence, one of hurt and confusion. One night, Julian was awakened from a restless sleep by the sound of his door chiming. He sat up, his heart quickening. Alexei stood in the doorway, not in one of his immaculate suits, but in a simple grey t-shirt and dark trousers. He looked younger, less like a king and more like a man. He was holding a bottle of vodka and 2 small glasses. "I have found," Alexei said, his voice quiet, "that conversation is often more productive when lubricated with our country's finest anesthetic." He walked in without waiting for an invitation and sat in the armchair by the window, the city lights painting patterns on his face. He poured 2 glasses, the clear liquid catching the light. He pushed one across the small table toward Julian. Julian hesitated, then got out of bed and sat opposite him. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "You have been avoiding me," Alexei stated. It was not an accusation, just a fact. I've been busy, Julian lied weakly. No, Alexei said, his gaze pinning Julian in place. You are afraid. Not of me, not anymore. You are afraid of this. He gestured to the space between them. And you are afraid of yourself. The accuracy of the statement was like a physical blow. Julian had nowhere to hide. He picked up the glass and drained it in one go, the alcohol burning a welcome fire down his throat. What do you want from me, Alexei? He asked, his voice raw. I already have what I want, Alexei replied, his voice soft. I have you. As a possession? A pet doctor? No. Alexei leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his intensity a magnetic force. When I first saw you, that night, you were surrounded by chaos and death, but you were a point of absolute stillness, of purpose. In my world, everything is transactional, conditional. Loyalty is bought, fear is leveraged, nothing is pure. But you, your skill, your focus, that was pure. I wanted it. I wanted to have something in my life that was not predicated on a lie. He looked down at his glass. I took you because I am a selfish man who takes what he wants. It is the only way I know how to acquire something beautiful. I build a cage for it. His honesty was disarming, devastating. He was laying himself bare, offering a glimpse into the barren landscape of his own soul. And now, Julian whispered. Alexei looked up, his grey eyes searching Julian's face. Now the cage is no longer sufficient. I find myself wanting the bird to sing, not because it is commanded to, but because it chooses to. He paused, the vulnerability in his expression a thing Julian never thought he would see. I have never in my life asked for anything. I take. But I am asking you, Julian, stay with me, not as a prisoner, but as, he struggled for the word, a man unused to the vocabulary of emotion, as my equal, as the only person I trust. The offer was impossible. It was everything he wanted and everything he feared. To accept was to legitimize his own captivity, to choose the cage. To refuse was to break the only real human connection he had felt in years, to step out into a world where men like Dmitri waited in the shadows. He looked at Alexei, at the powerful, lonely man who had stolen his life and then, impossibly, offered him a new one. The line between captor and savior had vanished completely. There was only this man, his flaws and his strengths laid bare in the quiet of the night. You say I owe you a life, Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. But you took mine. The debt is settled. I am free to go. Alexei's face shuttered, a flicker of pain in his eyes before the mask of control descended. He nodded slowly. Yes, he said, his voice flat. You are. He stood, his movements stiff. The doors will be unlocked in the morning. Kirill can arrange transport for you, wherever you wish to go. He started to walk toward the door, and a cold, absolute panic seized Julian. The thought of this man walking out of his life, of the silence returning, this time forever, was unbearable. It was more terrifying than any cage. Alexei, he called out, his voice cracking. Alexei stopped, his back to him. Julian stood, his legs unsteady. You said a life for a life, he said, the words tumbling out. You're right. A debt is owed. He walked toward Alexei, stopping just behind him. You saved me too, from a life that was already over, from loneliness, from Dmitri. He reached out, his hand hesitating before resting on Alexei's arm. He felt the muscle tense under his touch. So I'll give you a life, Julian whispered, his lips close to Alexei's ear. Mine. Not because you demand it, but because I am giving it to you. Alexei turned slowly, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning hope. He searched Julian's eyes, looking for the lie, the manipulation, the symptom of capture. He found none. He found only a terrifying, exhilarating truth. He raised a hand, his fingers tracing the line of Julian's jaw with a reverence that made Julian's breath catch. Julian, he breathed, his own name a prayer on Alexei's lips. And then he closed the small distance between them, his mouth claiming Julian's in a kiss that was not about ownership or control, but about a desperate, starving need. It was a kiss of surrender and victory, of two broken, lonely men finding a sanctuary in one another. The cage door was open, but Julian had no desire to fly away. He had found his freedom not in escape, but in choosing to stay. The morning after was a fragile, luminous thing. Julian awoke in Alexei's bed, the sheets a cloud of soft linen, the early light filtering through the vast windows. Alexei was already awake, sitting in a chair by the window, watching him. The usual armor of his tailored suits was gone, replaced by the simple intimacy of a robe. He looked peaceful. It was a word Julian would never have associated with him. When he saw Julian was awake, a small, tentative smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing the harsh lines of command and revealing the man beneath. "Good morning, Doctor," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble. "Good morning," Julian replied, the words feeling new, part of a language they were just beginning to invent together. The awkwardness of the new dynamic hung in the air, a delicate, shimmering veil. They were no longer captor and captive, but they were not yet simply lovers. They were two men navigating a territory for which there were no maps. Alexei seemed to feel it too. He stood and walked to the bed, sitting on the edge. He didn't touch Julian, but his proximity was a warmth that seeped into Julian's skin. "The doors are open," Alexei said quietly, his gaze steady. "My offer stands. You are free." It was a test, a final, crucial test of the foundation they had laid last night. Julian looked into those pale grey eyes, the colour of a winter sky, and saw not a commander, but a man holding his breath, waiting for a verdict. He reached out and placed his hand over Alexei's on the bed. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm. "My life is here, with you." The relief that washed over Alexei's face was profound. The tension left his shoulders, and he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He brought Julian's hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. "Then this is your home," he said, the words a vow, "not your prison." Their life began to reshape itself around this new truth. The physical confines were the same, but the emotional architecture had been rebuilt from the ground up. Julian was no longer confined to his suite. The entire penthouse, Alexei's fortress, became their shared space. He explored the rooms he had never been allowed to enter. A private cinema, a library filled with first editions, a greenhouse on a sheltered balcony where rare, exotic orchids bloomed in the controlled climate. A living metaphor Alexei had once used for him, now a shared garden. He was no longer just Alexei's physician. He became his partner, his confidant. He sat in on meetings, a silent presence at Alexei's side. He didn't understand the intricacies of the business, the brutal logistics of power, but he understood the man at the center of it. He could see the toll it took, the way Alexei's jaw would tighten, the way his gaze would grow distant. After these meetings, Julian would be the one to bring him a glass of whiskey, to place a hand on his shoulder, to draw him back from the cold, calculating world he inhabited. Julian, in turn, found his own purpose again. Alexei, understanding Julian's need to work, to use his hands, to heal, converted a section of the penthouse into a fully equipped pro bono clinic. Using a secure network and layers of anonymity that only Alexei's resources could provide, Julian began to consult on difficult cases from around the world. He performed remote surgical consultations, his mind once again engaged in the complex, beautiful work he was born to do. He was saving lives again, not with a scalpel in his hand, but with the brilliance of his mind. He was no longer a ghost. He was a surgeon again. Their intimacy was a quiet, profound thing. It was in the way Alexei would find him in the library and wrap a blanket around his shoulders when he'd fallen asleep over a book. It was in the way Julian would wait up for Alexei, no matter how late, and they would share a silent glass of vodka before bed. It was in the touches, a hand on the small of the back, fingers intertwined during a movie, a soft kiss to the temple. They learned each other's bodies, not with the franticness of that first night, but with a slow, deliberate exploration, a mapping of scars and sensitivities. Julian learned the story of each of Alexei's scars, each one a chapter in a brutal life. Alexei, in turn, treated Julian's own invisible wounds with a tenderness he hadn't known he was capable of. He was the only one who understood the lingering shame of Julian's dismissal, the ghost of the career he had lost. "They were fools to let you go," Alexei would say, his voice laced with a cold anger on Julian's behalf. "Their loss was my gain." The statement, once a mark of his possessiveness, now felt like a declaration of his devotion. The world outside the penthouse, however, had not forgotten them. The ecosystem of power Alexei commanded was predicated on strength and an absence of weakness. Dmitri's retreat had been a temporary one. Whispers began to circulate in the underworld. Alexei Volkov, the untouchable, the man of ice, had a weakness. A doctor. A man. The whispers were a poison, eroding the foundation of fear upon which Alexei's empire was built. Rivals began to test the boundaries, small incursions, like jackals circling a lion they suspect is wounded. Alexei handled it with his usual ruthless efficiency, but Julian saw the strain. The nights grew longer, the meetings more frequent. The peace they had built felt fragile, a bubble of light in a vast and encroaching darkness. One evening, Kirill entered the study where Alexei and Julian were reading in comfortable silence. The big man's face was grimmer than usual. "Sir," he said, his voice low, "we have a problem. It's Dmitri. He's made a move, not against us, against the supply lines in the south." "He's desperate," Alexei said, not looking up from his book. "Cut him off." "It's not that simple," Kirill said. "He's not trying to take them. He's burning them. He's causing chaos for the sake of chaos. And he's leaving a message. He says a king who protects a pet instead of his kingdom deserves to have neither." Alexei slowly closed his book. The placid calm of his face was gone, replaced by a chilling stillness. "He is trying to force my hand," he said softly. "He wants to make my men choose between their loyalty to me and their own survival." He stood and walked to the window, staring down at the city. Julian's heart went cold. He was the pet. He was the reason for this. His presence, the source of Alexei's newfound humanity, was now a liability that threatened to bring down everything he had built. "Alexei," Julian said, his voice quiet. Alexei turned to him, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a terrible conflict. "This is my world, Julian," he said. This is the price of power. Let me go, Julian said, the words tasting like ash. If I'm gone, Dmitri has no leverage. The whispers stop. Your position is secure. Alexei crossed the room and gripped Julian's shoulders, his hold firm, but not painful. No, he said, his voice a guttural command. That is not an option. You are not a strategic asset to be sacrificed. Do you understand me? But your empire. Damn my empire, Alexei snarled, his control finally breaking. It is a thing of iron and blood and money. It is replaceable. You are not. He pulled Julian to him, his arms wrapping around him in a fierce, desperate embrace. I will not lose you, he whispered into Julian's hair. I will burn the world down before I lose you. Julian clung to him, a terrible, selfish joy warring with his fear. He was loved. He was loved by this terrible, beautiful, dangerous man with a ferocity that defied all logic and reason. And that love was about to start a war. The choice had been made. Alexei would not sacrifice his king for his kingdom. He would go to war for him. And in the brutal world they inhabited, war meant only one thing: blood. The penthouse transformed. The quiet sanctuary became a war room. The minimalist spaces bristled with tactical screens, secure communication lines, and the quiet, lethal presence of Alexei's most trusted men. The air, once filled with the scent of books and sandalwood, now tasted of ozone and impending violence. Alexei was a different man, the lover and confidant replaced by the cold, calculating commander he had been born to be. He moved through the chaos with a terrifying focus, his voice low and decisive as he issued orders, marshalling his forces, anticipating Dmitri's every move. Yet even in the midst of it, his eyes would find Julian's across the room, a silent reassurance, a reminder of what was at stake. Julian felt like a ghost in this new reality, a civilian in a world of soldiers. He was the cause of all this, the human MacGuffin in a deadly game. Guilt was a physical weight on his shoulders. He tried to make himself useful, keeping the coffee flowing, ensuring the men ate, performing the small domestic tasks that felt absurdly out of place against the backdrop of strategic warfare. But his true role was to be Alexei's anchor. At night, when the planning was done and the men had retired to their posts, Alexei would come to their room, the armor of the commander stripped away, revealing the weary man beneath. He wouldn't speak of the war. He would simply pull Julian close, burying his face in Julian's neck, drawing strength from his presence. In these moments, Julian was not a liability. He was a reason. He was the peace Alexei was fighting for. The war was a thing of whispers and shadows, fought in unseen corners of the city. A warehouse fire here, a shipment gone missing there. It was a battle of attrition, and Dmitri, fueled by pure malice, was willing to burn everything to the ground. Alexei was more surgical. He dismantled Dmitri's operations piece by piece with a precision that was as breathtaking as it was brutal. But Dmitri had an endgame. He knew he couldn't win a conventional war against the full force of the Volkov Empire. His goal was not to win, but to inflict a wound that would never heal. His goal was Julian. It happened with a shocking, brutal simplicity. Kirill, the stone-faced guardian, had been lured away by a meticulously planned diversion, a multi-pronged attack on the penthouse's lower-level security that required his direct oversight. It left a window, a tiny one, but enough. Julian was in the greenhouse, tending to the orchids, the warm, humid air a temporary balm to his frayed nerves. He didn't hear them until it was too late. They were professionals, moving with a silence that was more terrifying than any sound. One moment, he was admiring a new, pale bloom. The next, a hand was clamped over his mouth, and a needle pricked his neck. The world dissolved into a black, roaring tunnel. He awoke to the smell of damp concrete and decay. He was in a place that felt horribly familiar, a dark, cavernous space that echoed with the drip of water. A single, bare bulb cast a sickly yellow light. It was a warehouse, a mirror of the place where he had first saved Alexi's life. He was tied to a chair, his body aching, his head thick with the residue of the drug. Dmitri was sitting opposite him, casually perched on a wooden crate, a gun resting on his knee. "Welcome back to the world, Doctor," Dmitri said, with a lazy smile. "I do apologize for the accommodations. They lack the finesse of Alexi's sky palace, but they have a certain rustic charm, don't you think?" Julian tested his bonds. They were tight. Escape was impossible. "What do you want, Dmitri?" "What I've always wanted," he replied, his smile widening. "To see the great Alexei Volkov on his knees. He built his empire on the myth of his own invincibility, his lack of weakness, and then he found you, a fatal flaw in his perfect design. I'm just exploiting it." He stood and began to pace. "He's been taking me apart, you know. He's very good, precise, surgical, you might say. But he's been distracted, trying to protect you. And that gave me the opening I needed." He stopped in front of Julian, his face hardening. "He'll come for you. He'll walk in here, alone, because he won't risk his prize in a firefight. He'll come here expecting to negotiate. But there will be no negotiation." He gestured to the shadows, where Julian could now make out the shapes of at least a dozen armed men. "This is not a trap to capture him. It's an execution. And you, my dear doctor, will have a front row seat. You will watch him die for you. It seems a fittingly poetic end. A life for a life. Isn't that his code?" The cold, clinical cruelty of it stole Julian's breath. This was it, the end game. He had been so focused on his own guilt, he hadn't truly considered the depth of Dmitri's sadism. He wasn't just a rival. He was a psychopath. Julian's mind, the surgeon's mind, began to work. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He assessed the situation, the room, the men, Dmitri's arrogance, his own position. He couldn't fight, but he was a doctor. His knowledge was his only weapon. He looked around, his eyes scanning the filthy floor. He saw discarded chemical drums, rusted metal, pools of stagnant water. An idea, desperate and insane, began to form. He needed a distraction. He needed a weapon. And he needed to warn Alexei. "You're a fool, Dmitri," Julian said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You think this will break him. It will make him a martyr. His men will tear you apart." Dmitri laughed. "Let them try. By the time they rally, I'll be gone, and the Volkov Empire will be a headless snake." Julian's eyes flicked to a drum near Dmitri, its label partially peeled but still legible. Caustic soda. Lye. Highly corrosive. Mixed with water, it creates a powerful exothermic reaction. Mixed with certain metals, like the aluminum shavings he could see near a discarded piece of machinery. A volatile, explosive reaction. A chemical bomb. It was a long shot, a desperate, insane gamble. He needed to get to it. He started to cough, a dry, racking sound. Then he let his body go limp, his head slumping to his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. "What's wrong with him?" one of Dmitri's men asked nervously. Dmitri scowled and kicked Julian's chair. Get up. Julian didn't respond. He let a thin trickle of saliva run from the corner of his mouth, his eyes fluttering weakly. He was a doctor. He knew how to fake a seizure, a vasovagal syncope, a reaction to the drug he'd been given. "He's crashing," Julian wheezed, forcing the words out. "The drug. My heart." Dimitri's face tightened. A dead hostage was no use to him. "Get him on the floor," he snapped. "Try to stabilize him." Two men moved forward and clumsily cut the ropes binding him to the chair. They dragged him onto the concrete floor. It was the opening he needed. As they laid him down, he convulsed, his flailing limbs knocking over the drum of caustic soda. The white powder spilled across the damp floor, instantly beginning to hiss and steam. At the same time, his seizure sent his foot kicking out, scattering the pile of aluminum shavings into the spreading, reactive pool. "Get back," Julian screamed, his voice suddenly strong and clear. "It's going to blow." Dimitri's men, seeing the smoke and the violent hissing, panicked. They scrambled back, their professional discipline forgotten in the face of an unknown chemical threat. In that split second of chaos, as Dimitri was shouting at his men, Julian lunged for Dimitri's ankle, pulling him off balance. Dimitri stumbled, his gun flying from his hand and skittering across the floor. It was all the distraction needed. The front of the warehouse exploded inwards, not from a chemical reaction, but from a controlled, overwhelming assault. The roar was deafening. Men in black tactical gear poured in, moving with the fluid, lethal grace of apex predators. It wasn't a rescue. It was an eradication, and at the head of them, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of terrible, beautiful fury, was Alexei. He saw Julian on the floor, saw Dimitri scrambling for his gun, and without hesitation fired 2 shots. The sound was flat, clinical. Dimitri crumpled to the ground, his surprise permanent. The firefight was over in seconds. Alexei's men were a whirlwind of brutal efficiency. Silence descended, thick with the smell of cordite and blood. Alexei rushed to Julian's side, his eyes wild with terror and relief. He dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over Julian, afraid to touch, as if he might break. "Julian, are you hurt? Talk to me." Julian pushed himself up, his body screaming with adrenaline. "I'm fine," he breathed. "Alexei, I'm fine." Alexei pulled him into an embrace so tight it felt like he was trying to merge their bodies into one. He was trembling. The invincible Alexei Volkov was trembling. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion Julian had never heard from him before, raw, unfiltered love. Julian held him, bearing his face in Alexei's shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, the scent of home. "You found me," Julian said. "You always find me." Alexei pulled back, his hands framing Julian's face. He looked at the spilled chemicals, the panicked ingenuity of it all. "You saved yourself," Alexei said, a look of awe on his face. "And you saved me." He leaned in and kissed him, a desperate, searching kiss, a reaffirmation of life in a room full of death. The debt was paid, a life for a life, 100 times over. The aftermath was quiet. The bodies were removed, the blood was cleaned, the warehouse was sealed. It was as if it had never happened. But everything had changed. Back in the penthouse, the war room was dismantled, the tactical screens replaced by art, the silence returning. But it was a new kind of silence, one born not of emptiness, but of peace. Alexei's empire was secure. With Dimitri gone, his power was more absolute than ever. But the victory felt hollow to him. The only thing that mattered was sitting beside him on the sofa, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his head resting against Alexi's. They sat for hours, watching the city lights come on, not speaking. There was nothing left to say. Everything had been said in the violence and the fear and the desperate, clinging relief. Julian was no longer a possession, a partner, or even a lover. He was a part of Alexei, the part that made him human, the part he could not live without. Later, in their bed, Alexei held Julian, his hand spread over Julian's chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. "I almost lost you," Alexei whispered into the darkness. "The world is not safe for you, for us." "Nowhere is safe," Julian replied, his voice soft. "But this is our place. We'll make it safe." Alexei was silent for a moment. "I have considered liquidating everything," he said, the admission stunning in its vulnerability. "Selling the empire, piece by piece. We could disappear. A private island, a villa in the mountains, anywhere, just you and me, away from all this." It was the ultimate fantasy, freedom, an escape from the world of blood and power he had built. Julian turned in his arms to face him. He reached up and touched Alexei's face, the faint scar on his jaw. "And what would you be then, Alexei?" he asked gently. "A retired king? A ghost? This world, this power, it is part of you. It is the armor you wear. To take it away would be to diminish you. I don't want a diminished man. I want you, all of you. The commander, the collector, the killer, the lover." Alexei looked at him, his pale eyes luminous in the dark. "And you are not afraid?" "I am terrified," Julian admitted with a small, wry smile. "But I am more afraid of a life without you. We don't need to run. We just need each other." He leaned in and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss full of promise and acceptance. It was a seal on their new reality. They would not hide from the world. They would face it, together. Their home was not a fortress against the world, but an island of their own making in the heart of it. Life settled into its final, true form. A partnership forged in fire and blood. Alexei ruled his empire, his hand as firm as ever, but his motives had changed. He fought not for power, but for peace, for the sanctuary he had built for the man he loved. Julian, in turn, was his anchor, his conscience, his home. He continued his work, his mind and hands saving lives in a world far removed from theirs, a constant reminder of the good they could put into the world, a counterbalance to the darkness. They were a paradox, a healer and a killer, a prisoner and a king. But in the quiet intimacy of their life together, they were just Julian and Alexei. One evening, months later, they were standing on the balcony, the city a silent, glittering beast below them. The air was cool and clean. Alexei came up behind Julian, wrapping his arms around his waist, resting his chin on his shoulder. "Do you remember the first thing I said to you in this room?" Alexei asked, his voice a low murmur against Julian's ear. "You told me my life belonged to you," Julian replied, a faint smile on his lips. "I was wrong," Alexei said. He turned Julian around to face him. He took Julian's hand, the surgeon's hand, and placed it on his own chest, directly over his heart, the heart that Julian had saved. "Your life was never mine to take," Alexei said, his grey eyes holding Julian's with an intensity that was more powerful than any command. "My life, however, has been yours since the moment you laid your hands on me." He leaned in, and his lips met Julian's. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of quiet, absolute truth, a final binding contract, a life freely given, a debt transformed into a gift. In the heart of the city, in their palace in the sky, the king and his doctor had found their own kind of peace, a kingdom of two built on a foundation of scars, trust, and a love that was as fierce and uncompromising as the world they had conquered together.